The heat of his hand was the only thing keeping her from fading into the gray. Elias didn't look at the dull, flickering pulse of her skin with the pity of her own kind. He gripped her shoulder, his thumb tracing the ridge of her collarbone where the light had almost died. Around them, the life support vents of Orlis Prime groaned, spewing crystalline frost that coated the metal walls. Her people were already retreating to the inner sanctum, abandoning the dim ones to the creeping cold. But Elias stayed. He braced his boots against the vibrating floor, his breathing ragged in the thin air, and pulled her closer into the circle of his warmth. My light was dim, but his eyes saw a sun, she whispered, the words catching in a throat that felt like it was lined with glass. It had started 3 cycles ago at the Great Descent. The ceremony was supposed to be the pinnacle of Illumina's existence, a moment where the high caste males selected their partners based on the brilliance of their biological wattage. Kale had stood in the line, her skin a muted, dusty amber, while the women beside her flared with the intensity of supernova bursts. One by one, the candidates were claimed. The hall was a kaleidoscope of blinding whites and electric blues, a celebration of what the High Council called genetic purity. But purity had a hidden cost. For generations, the Lumina had filtered their bloodlines so strictly that they were becoming fragile, their internal glow a beautiful mask for failing immune systems and brittle spirits. Kale was a glitch in the system, a low glow. When the final suitor turned his back on her flickering rhythmic pulse, the silence of the chamber felt heavier than the vacuum of space. Exile was the only path for those who couldn't illuminate the dark. She had wandered into the Terran sector because the humans didn't care about light. They lived in the shadows of the station, surrounded by the smell of burnt oil and the constant rhythmic clanking of wrenches against pipes. That was where she found Elias. He was hunched over a dismantled atmospheric regulator, his face streaked with grease, swearing at a stubborn bolt. When he looked up, he didn't recoil from her dimness. In fact, he looked intrigued. To him, she wasn't a failing battery. She was a miracle of biology he didn't yet understand. Over the weeks that followed, the gap between them narrowed. He showed her how to bypass a circuit with a piece of copper wire, and she showed him how the Lumina could sense the vibrations of the station's hull through their feet. They sat in the cramped corners of his workshop, the air thick with the scent of soldering flux. He told her about Earth, a place where people were a messy, chaotic mix of everything, and how that chaos was exactly what made them strong. Evolution is a wall, love is the sledgehammer, he told her one night, his fingers brushing against hers. For the first time, her skin didn't just flicker, it hummed. It wasn't the blinding, sterile light of the high caste. It was a deep, resonant warmth that moved in time with the thud of his heart. Then, the primary cooling array on Orlis Prime fractured. The high caste Lumina, so focused on the elegance of their own light, had forgotten how to maintain the grit of the machines that kept them alive. As the temperature plummeted and the station's automated systems began to fail, the purebloods panicked, their brilliant lights fading into frantic, jagged strobes. Kale stood with Elias at the edge of the maintenance tunnels, watching the frost climb the walls. The station was dying, but in the dark, they had found a different kind of strength. The air in the maintenance sublevel tasted like sharp copper and old ice. Elias wasn't moving like a hero. He was moving like a man who knew exactly how much skin he was about to lose to the freezing metal. He jammed a manual override lever, his knuckles cracking as the frost bit into his grip. Beside him, Kale felt her internal pulse stutter. The Lumina life support wasn't just a machine. It was a bioreactive network that required the specific frequency of her people to stabilize the cooling salts. But the high caste were too weak, their over-refined light flickering out in the face of the mechanical failure. The bypass won't hold, Elias gritted out, his breath blooming in thick white clouds. The thermal sensors don't recognize the Terran signature. It needs a Lumina handshake, Kale. It needs the glow. She looked at her hands. They were dull, a bruised violet color that signified the end of her reserves. She didn't have the brilliant, searing heat of the council members. She was a low glow, a fading ember in a station turning into a tomb. But then Elias reached out. He didn't just touch her, He interlaced his fingers with hers, pressing his palm flat against her skin. The heat of his biology, the raw, caloric fire of a species that had survived ice ages and deserts without the crutch of bioluminescence, flooded into her. It wasn't a handshake, it was a bridge. Kale closed her eyes and let the human's frantic, stubborn heartbeat become her own. She channeled his warmth through her failing nodes, filtering his raw energy into the Lumina interface. The console beneath their hand shrieked, then settled into a deep, resonant thrum. The amber light of her skin didn't just brighten, it changed. It became a rich golden hue, thick and steady, fueled by the hybrid connection. The cooling salts began to glow in response, the temperature in the corridors creeping back from the ledge of absolute zero. They stood there for hours, anchored to each other as the station's lifeblood stabilized. When the High Council finally arrived, cloaked in their pale, shivering silks, they found a mechanic and an exile huddled together over a glowing terminal. The Council's purity had left them powerless in the dark, but Kale's weakness had been the very thing that allowed her to fuse with the alien energy of the Terran. In the months that followed, the old laws crumbled. The Council couldn't argue with survival. The Bridge Child was born a year later, a daughter with Elias's dark, curious eyes and a skin that held a constant, unbreakable shimmer, one that never needed a ceremony to stay lit. She was the proof that the Lumina had been dying of their own perfection. They stood on the observation deck, watching the three suns of Aurelus Prime dip below the horizon. Elias wrapped his arm around her, and Kale leaned her head against his shoulder, her golden light mingling with the shadow of his jacket. "We weren't a mistake," she whispered, watching their daughter reach for the stars through the reinforced glass. "We were the upgrade." The station hummed beneath them, no longer a fragile palace of light, but a resilient machine of bone, metal, and heart.